They destroyed 60 German tanks. They fought their way from France to the heart of Germany, spent 183 days in continuous combat. General Patton called them the best tankers in his army, but America kept silent about them for 33 years after the war. Why did the country hide heroes who saved thousands of Allied lives? Because all 600 soldiers in this battalion were black. This is the story of the 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers. The story of men who fought on two fronts simultaneously, against the Nazis in Europe and against racism in their own country. Spring 1942 was hot at Fort Hood, Texas. 600 African Americans in new uniforms stood in formation on the parade ground of the military base. They came from all over the country, from southern states and northern cities, from farms and factories. Each had volunteered for the army to defend a country that didn't consider them equal citizens. In those years, the American military was strictly segregated. Black soldiers served separately from whites, ate in separate mess halls, and slept in separate barracks. They weren't trusted with complex military equipment or combat operations. It was believed that African Americans were suited only for support work, cooking food, loading ammunition, and digging trenches. But the war demanded more men, and military command decided to conduct an experiment. For the first time in U.S. history, an all-black tank battalion was formed. No one believed in the success of this undertaking. Skeptics said that colored soldiers couldn't handle managing complex equipment, wouldn't withstand the psychological pressure of combat, and couldn't function as a cohesive unit. A white officer, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, was appointed battalion commander. This was an unusual choice. Bates didn't share the racist prejudices of his time and treated his subordinates as equals. He saw in them not skin color, but soldiers ready to fight for their country. Preparation began immediately. The soldiers had to master operating Sherman M4 tanks, learn to shoot while moving, coordinate crew actions, and repair equipment in field conditions. The training program was designed for 2 years, but they were given only 1. Texas greeted the recruits with scorching heat and open hostility. The local population didn't hide their contempt for black soldiers. In the town near the base, they weren't allowed into most stores and restaurants. White military police constantly harassed battalion soldiers, looking for any excuse to arrest them. But the cruelest test was the training itself. Instructors gave no breaks, and on the contrary, demanded more from black soldiers than from white units. They wanted to prove the experiment was doomed to fail. Soldiers trained from dawn to dusk, studied tank mechanics, practiced shooting, and drilled tactical maneuvers. Eugene Knighton, a young man from Mississippi, first sat at tank controls on his 23rd birthday. Before the war, he worked at a textile factory and had never operated anything more complex than a truck. Now he had to master a 30-ton machine armed with a cannon and machine guns. Gradually, the disparate group of recruits transformed into a cohesive combat unit. Soldiers learned to trust each other and rely on comrades in critical situations. Inside the battalion, there was no room for racial prejudice. There were only tankers, brothers in arms. By summer 1943, the battalion had completed basic training. Soldiers choose an unofficial emblem, a black panther on an orange background. This symbol perfectly reflected their essence. The panther, a strong, graceful, deadly predator. It doesn't attack first, but is always ready to defend itself. The battalion motto was simple and convincing: "Come out fighting." These words became a manifesto for hundreds of black tankers. They prepared not just to fight, they prepared to prove to the whole world they were worthy of respect. Parallel to military training was another battle. The battalion faced constant sabotage from military bureaucracy. They were supplied with obsolete tanks, equipment was delayed, and deployment dates to Europe were postponed. It seemed someone higher up hoped the experiment would quietly fail and could be forgotten. But Commander Bates stubbornly fought for his soldiers to receive the same as white units. He wrote reports, called Washington, and used all his connections. Gradually, the situation began to change. The battalion received new Sherman tanks and modern equipment. In early 1944, an event occurred that finally united the battalion. The famous boxer Joe Louis, heavyweight champion of the world, visited the base. He himself served in the Army and specifically requested permission to visit them. 761st Battalion. Louis spent the entire day with the soldiers, boxed in the ring, talked about his fights, and inspired the fighters. In fall 1944, the long-awaited order came. The 761st Tank Battalion was shipping to Europe. Soldiers boarded transport ships and sailed across the Atlantic. Most were leaving America for the first time, seeing the ocean for the first time. The journey took 3 weeks. The ships were crowded. Seasickness affected half the personnel. But morale remained high. Finally, they had a chance to prove their worth in real combat, not on a training range. The battalion landed in France in October 1944, 4 months after the famous D-Day landing. By this time, Allied forces had already liberated Paris and were advancing toward Germany's borders. But the toughest months of war lay ahead. The first weeks passed in relative calm. The battalion guarded communications, escorted transports, and patrolled liberated territories. Black tankers first encountered an amazing phenomenon. The French population treated them without prejudice, welcomed them as liberators, and invited them into homes. This was a shock for soldiers from the American South who had faced discrimination their entire lives. In France, white women smiled at them on the streets, children asked for candy, and old men thanked them for liberation. For the first time in their lives, these men felt like real citizens, not outcasts of society. But war gave no respite. In early November, the battalion received orders to join General George Patton's Third Army. This was the finest hour for the Black Panthers. Patton was renowned as one of the best Allied commanders, tough and demanding, but fair. The first real battle occurred on November 7, 1944, near the French town of Morville-les-Vicq. German troops fiercely resisted the Allied advance, turning every village into a fortified strongpoint. The battalion was tasked with supporting infantry in an attack on enemy positions. Sherman tanks formed up in battle order at dawn. Crew commanders received final instructions over the radio. Eugene Knighton sat in his tank and felt his heart pounding. 2 years of preparation led to this moment. Now it would be decided whether General Patton was right to trust them with a combat mission. On signal, tanks moved forward. German artillery opened fire almost immediately. Shells exploded left and right, throwing up fountains of earth. Driver mechanics maneuvered tanks in zigzags, trying to complicate enemy targeting. Gunners searched for targets through sights. The battalion's first tank was knocked out 20 minutes after the attack began. A German anti-tank gun fired a shell at close range, penetrating armor at a vulnerable spot. The crew managed to abandon the burning machine, but the commander received serious wounds. The remaining tanks continued the advance. They suppressed enemy firing points, cleared the way for infantry, and destroyed enemy equipment. The battle lasted all day without bad break. Evening, the objective was achieved, and German positions were captured. The 761st Battalion completed its first combat mission, but the price was high. 3 tanks knocked out, 7 men killed, and 12 wounded. This was a bitter victory, but it proved the main point. Black tankers could fight as well as whites. The following months became a test of endurance. The battalion participated in continuous battles across France and Belgium. They took city after city, village after village, meter by meter, reclaiming European soil from the Nazis. December 1944 brought a new trial. German forces began a desperate counter-offensive in the Ardennes, which entered history as the Battle of the Bulge. This was the last major Wehrmacht offensive on the Western Front. Hitler threw his last reserves into battle, hoping to reverse the war's course. The 761st Battalion found itself at the center of the battle. The temperature dropped below freezing, and snowstorms began. Tanks moved with difficulty on iced roads. Soldiers froze in steel machines that had no proper heating. Many suffered frostbite. German Tiger and Panther tanks exceeded American Shermans in armor and firepower. In direct confrontation, Shermans often lost. But American tankers compensated for the enemy's technical superiority with tactics and courage. They learned to attack German tanks in groups, from flanks and rear, where armor was weaker. They used terrain for maneuvering and hid behind buildings and hills. Gradually, invaluable combat experience accumulated. During these days, the battalion suffered heavy losses. Every day brought news of fallen comrades. Tanks burned, men died, but the battalion continued executing orders. Retreat wasn't considered an option. By the end of January 1945, the German offensive had run out of steam. The Allies threw the enemy back to initial positions and resumed their own offensive. The 761st Battalion received a brief respite for replenishment and equipment repair. Spring 1945 began with crossing the Rhine. This was a grand operation involving hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers. The 761st Battalion was tasked with ensuring the crossing of infantry units across the river and establishing a foothold on the opposite bank. German troops desperately defended every meter of their homeland. They blew up bridges, mined roads, and set up ambushes. But nothing could stop the advance. Allied armies rolled across Germany like a steamroller, tightening the ring around Berlin. The battalion liberated one German city after another. The population greeted them with fear, expecting revenge for Nazi atrocities. But American soldiers behaved with discipline. They didn't loot, didn't take revenge on civilians, and observed the laws of war. In April 1945, an event occurred that changed battalion soldiers forever. They stumbled upon a small concentration camp in a Bavarian village. What the tankers saw was impossible to describe in words. Thousands of emaciated prisoners, more like skeletons. Mountains of corpses that guards hadn't managed to burn. Gas chambers, crematoria, evidence of monstrous medical experiments. Battalion soldiers liberated the survivors and arrested the camp guards. This discovery shocked even battle-hardened veterans. They understood what they were fighting for, what evil they were combating. No words about democracy and freedom could convey the truth as clearly as these concentration camps. The battalion continued moving east. They participated in capturing major cities, liberated Allied PPOWs, and accepted German unit surrenders. By the end of April, enemy resistance had virtually ceased. On May 8, 1945, Germany capitulated. The war in Europe was over. The 761st Tank Battalion had traveled from the French coast to the heart of Germany, spent 183 consecutive days in combat, and participated in 6 major campaigns. The battalion's statistics were impressive. During combat, the Black Panthers destroyed or captured 60 German tanks, about 900 other armored vehicles and transports, and thousands of enemy soldiers. They fought their way through France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, and Austria. But victory came at a high price. 300 men from the battalion were killed or wounded. This was nearly half the original strength. Every surviving soldier lost close friends and witnessed the death of comrades. Eugene Knighton survived the entire war and returned home with many awards. His tank was knocked out twice. He received a light shrapnel wound, but he continued fighting. When the war ended, he was only 24 years old but felt like an old man. General Patton personally thanked the battalion for their service. He called the Black Panthers one of the best tank units in his army. His words meant much, because Patton didn't hand out compliments freely. Battalion soldiers received numerous combat awards. Among them were 11 Silver Stars, about 70 Bronze Stars, and hundreds of Purple Hearts. These were well-deserved awards, paid for with blood and courage. But the most important award was recognition. The 761st Battalion proved that black soldiers could fight as bravely and effectively as whites. They destroyed racist stereotypes through the force of their actions, not words. In summer 1945, the battalion began preparing to return to America. Soldiers dreamed of home, of families, of peaceful life. They hoped the country they fought for would finally recognize them as equal citizens. The journey home across the Atlantic passed in a festive atmosphere. Music played on the ships, and soldiers shared memories and made plans for the future. It seemed the worst was behind them. Ahead waited well-deserved rest and the nation's gratitude. But America greeted them coldly. Yes, the war ended. Yes, fascism was defeated. But racial segregation in the U.S. hadn't gone anywhere. Soldiers who fought against racism in Europe returned to a country where legislative racism reigned. In the South, they were still prohibited from entering white restaurants, using public transportation with white passengers, and studying in the same schools as white children. Jim Crow laws remained in force. War veterans had to sit in the back of the bus. Many battalion soldiers faced the inability to find work. Employers preferred hiring white veterans. Banks refused black men home loans. Society quickly forgot their exploits and returned to familiar prejudices. This was vast, bitter disappointment. Soldiers risked their lives defending freedom and democracy. They saw how they were treated in France, without racial prejudice, and now at home they were again considered second-class citizens. Some veterans couldn't reconcile with this injustice. They became activists in the civil rights movement, which was gaining strength in the post-war years. Their military experience taught them not to surrender in the face of superior forces. Decades after the war, the story of the 761st Battalion remained little known. History textbooks didn't mention them. Hollywood war films told of white soldiers' exploits. The Black Panthers were forgotten, as if their feats didn't matter. Battalion Commander Paul Bates devoted the rest of his life to fighting for recognition of his soldiers' merits. He wrote letters to Congress, collected documents, and gave interviews. Bates considered it unjust that the battalion didn't receive the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest award for a military unit. Battalion veterans regularly met at reunions. They shared memories, supported each other, and preserved the memory of fallen comrades. Each year there were fewer of them. Time took its toll. In 1978, the first breakthrough occurred. President Jimmy Carter awarded the 761st Battalion the Presidential Unit Citation for outstanding courage in combat. This happened 33 years after the war ended, but better late than never. The award became an important moment of recognition. Finally, official confirmation of what battalion soldiers and their commanders always knew. The Black Panthers were an elite unit worthy of respect and honors. In the 1990s and 2000s, interest in the battalion's history increased. Books and documentaries about the Black Panthers appeared. Historians began studying their combat path, collecting testimonies from surviving veterans. In 1997, a memorial to the 761st Battalion was unveiled at Fort Hood, where the battalion trained. The ceremony was attended by surviving veterans, now elderly men. They stood before the monument and remembered the young men with whom they began their journey 60 years ago. Eugene Knighton died in 2003 at age 82. Until the end of his life, he regularly spoke at schools, telling young people about the war and the importance of fighting racism. His last interview was recorded a month before his death. The story of the 761st Tank Battalion is more than a military chronicle. It's a tale of men who fought for the right to be called full citizens of their country. They proved their courage and professionalism on European battlefields, but the real battle for equality continued for decades after the war. The Black Panthers contributed to victory over fascism. They also paved the way for following generations of African Americans in the U.S. Armed Forces. Their example showed that racial integration is not only possible, but also makes the military stronger. Today, people of all races and nationalities serve in the American military on equal terms. This seems natural and right. But the path to this was long and difficult. Soldiers of the 761st Battalion walked this path first, proving with their blood the right to equality. Their motto, "Come out fighting," remains relevant. It reminds us that justice must always be fought for, that dignity must be defended, not waited for to be given. That true courage is shown not only on the battlefield, but also in the daily struggle for one's rights. The memory of the Black Panthers lives on. Their story teaches us that prejudice can only be defeated by action, that courage doesn't depend on skin color, that true heroes don't always receive recognition immediately, but justice triumphs sooner or later.